This video will be part 2 of Chapter 8, B.F. Skinner's Radical Behaviorism for PSY 230, Personality Theory. Before we get more into how B.F. Skinner explained learning, and by extension how he explained human personality, we need to back up a little bit and review some things that you probably learned when you were in introductory psychology. We need to, remind ourselves what respondent or classical conditioning is. As you learned it, you probably learned about Pavlov's famous experiment with dogs. Ivan Pavlov was studying the digestive system, and he noticed that he was using dogs and measuring their salivary output. And he noticed that the dogs picked up on certain cues in the environment that tended to be followed by the presentation of food. And what would happen is that when these random sort of sounds or cues in the environment were present, the dogs would salivate even though no food had yet been presented. So then he started to study this effect directly, and what he found was that the classic example is if he rings a bell, he could reliably produce a salivary response, which is an involuntary behavior when it was paired with a cueing indicator in the environment. So the key thing to understanding respondent conditioning is this is not voluntary behavior. These are reflex behaviors, things that are involuntary, like blinking your eye when when a puff of air is blown into it. So when you go for your annual eye exam, for example, you get a glaucoma test where they puff an air blast into your eye. One of the problems optometrists often have with that test is that once people have experienced it once, they tend to pick up on noises that the machine might make, and reflexively their eye will blink before the puff of air arrives. Those are respondent behaviors. Or you smell that blissful smell of chocolate chip cookies, or maybe it's French fries that do it for you, and your mouth just waters. That's respondent or reflexive behavior. Respondent behavior is really under the control of predictors in the environment, i.e. antecedents. So think about how there are certain foods that just make you nauseous, probably because you had gotten sick after eating those foods. So the smells or even the circumstances that are connected with those foods can prompt a nausea response, and then avoidance of that food in the future. That's really a classically conditioned, almost with just one trial, classically conditioned response, where the antecedent, maybe an odor or a particular taste, becomes an antecedent for becoming ill, and it can then prompt nausea and aversion in response to it. Or positive things like a positive smell, or the sounds associated with that positive smell can then become predictive. They are antecedents of a really good thing happening. So if it's a food, the sounds of a restaurant that's busy, the smells that are associated with that restaurant, they become antecedents, and they can make us feel hungrier while we're experiencing those antecedents. Another key component of respondent or classical conditioning is that the organism, whether you're talking about a human or a dog or even a fish, the organism is going to automatically respond. So another example is a startle response. If there's a loud noise, we initially startle to that noise. What if you pair that big loud noise with a predictor, an antecedent, like an additional sound, like a tone, or it could be a visual stimulus, like a light. For example, if you have a rat in a cage, and you demonstrate, you can startle the rat with a very loud noise. What if you turned on a red light when the noise was coming? the rat would learn that the red light predicts loud noise, and they would begin to startle just to the display of the red light without the noise even coming after it. So there you're classically conditioning a reflexive behavior. In operant conditioning, this is what Skinner specialized in, however, you're talking about voluntary behaviors. And basically it's an operant because it's operated on by manipulating the circumstances that predict the behavior, and most importantly, by delivering a consequence after the behavior occurs. So operant behaviors involve strengthening or weakening behaviors of interest that by manipulating the events that follow. So you're manipulating the consequences. You may have antecedents. That's the classical conditioning part. But what you're doing is you're training behaviors that are voluntarily exhibited. So in the cartoon here, the adult dog is explaining to the puppy, they give you lots of treats while you're training, so play dumb for as long as you can. So the idea is with operant conditioning is you offer rewards for behaviors that you want to continue, and you either ignore or you punish behaviors that you want to weaken. Learning is declared to have happened when you given a cue or an antecedent that the organism recognizes, and then the behavior is exhibited, and then a consequence follows it. So learning happens when you follow an operant response or a voluntary behavior with either a positive or negative reinforcement. Any reinforcement, you might remember this from your introductory classes, any reinforcement makes a behavior more likely. So in the case of positive reinforcement, you're giving something the organism likes, such as a reward. If I'm training a dog, I present a treat. That's a positive reinforcement. Or I give the dog praise. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, let's say I'm trying to teach a dog not to pull on the leash. Pulling means that the dog's going to hit the leash and it causes discomfort on their neck. That discomfort is released when the dog slows down and stops pulling. That's an example of negative reinforcement. Or a human example of negative reinforcement, if I wanted, when my kids were small and I wanted them to clean up their rooms, I was often tempted to try and use negative reinforcement, whereby I would nag and nag and nag and nag until they finally gave up and went in and cleaned their rooms. Nagging is the negative reinforcer. They want that to go away, so I stop nagging as soon as they clean their rooms. That's different from a punishment. So if I were trying to encourage my kids to clean up their room and they haven't done it, it's the not cleaning that I want to punish. So I may take away their phones until their rooms are cleaned. Now what I've done there is a double thing. I've punished them by taking away their phones because they haven't cleaned their rooms. When they clean their rooms, then they get a reinforcer, they get their phone back. So the punishment is the removal of the phone, the reinforcer is giving the phone back. So we're back to our ABCs again. Antecedents, behaviors, consequences. Antecedents are things that are prompts. They may be cues. In more complex organisms, you may be modeling the behavior. In complex organisms like humans, you may be giving feedback or presenting goals. Behaviors can either be classified as behaviors you want, if you're doing the training, or behaviors that are undesirable, that you want to have go away. For example, I have my current foster dog is very frightened of human beings. So what I have to do as her foster is, and you might hear her kind of clicking away in the background, she's pacing because she's a bit anxious. She doesn't understand why I'm talking so much. Anyway, she's afraid of people. So how do I reinforce her for approaching humans? I use antecedents. She seems to respond to a kissing noise, so I will kiss, kiss, and call her name. That's an antecedent. If she moves toward me I remain calm and I say, good. If she's close enough, I give her a treat. The undesired behavior is when she skitters away, when she retreats. Now, I don't punish that. That's the opposite of what I want to do. Mostly I ignore that behavior. I reintroduce the antecedent, encourage her to return. When she returns, she gets another treat. So I'm systematically reinforcing using positive reinforcement in the form of a treat or praise for approach behaviors. And I'm ignoring, through extinction training, the avoidance behaviors. Now, there are times when I need to prevent her from escaping. So if she's very fearful of people, her natural instinct is she sees people, she wants to run away. So I do prevent that so that she has to learn to tolerate the environment that makes her anxious and fearful. Now that part of it, encouraging her to put up with a fear-inducing experience through exposure, I'm in part classically conditioning a non-fear response there. And then using positive reinforcement when she engages, when she is a little braver, when she gives me behaviors that are more social with humans. Negative reinforcement is tricky, and with these fearful dogs, punishment is absolutely off the table. You cannot use it with the fearful dogs, particularly if they are fearful of people, because all they will be getting is the message that you are a dangerous force and you cause pain in their life. So mostly through positive reinforcement, I will encourage those social behaviors. Now here's an example of Skinner using operant conditioning to train an organism to give him a very specific behavior. Oops. Clicked the wrong button.
And we're going to try another pigeon now, and I will try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Right, Ron? The bird has been already conditioned to eat when the magazine sounds, when the light flashes. Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit. It's not doing anything in particular, you see. But I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. Well, you see the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
So if you take this apart in terms of antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, what you've got is a pigeon. Now, pigeons naturally kind of prance around. They don't stand still for very long. So Skinner's taking advantage of the fact that this is a bird that knows how to walk around and root for food and look for food. Now, this particular bird has already been trained to eat from this feed device. And basically what Skinner is holding in his hand is, an early version of a remote. He's got it set up so that the machine is going to give the bird a cue whenever food is being delivered. The light bulb will light up, and the bird will also hear the sound of the mechanism dropping food into the pan. So every time you heard that click and the light, those are antecedents. They're predictors for the bird. The bird then knows food is in the pan, I go to the pan and I get to eat. So then the behavior. Skinner has chosen a behavior that's within the natural repertoire of the bird, that is prancing around, and he's going to then shape that into turning a complete circle. And notice how he identifies nuggets of that behavior. So a little head turn to the left, and then he gets a little more of that turn, and then a little more, and a little more, and eventually the bird turns all the way around. Now understand that this is a bird who has been trained to eat from the pan already. So there's some pre-training that would have to occur before you could train that more complicated behavior of turning in a circle. First, for several days, the bird would have to be in an enclosed space where you could train it to eat from the pan, train it to recognize the sound of the click, that means food is being delivered, and train it to recognize the light as a predictor of food delivery. So with that pre-training, then what you have to do as the trainer is isolate the behavior you want, break it into pieces, and systematically reinforce the pieces that you want to have repeated. Now here's another example of a more complicated behavior. Now again, recognize that these animals have been given a great amount of pre-training. So they understand the sound that predicts food going into their pan. They also have been trained to hit a ball, a ping pong ball, across a surface in order to get rewards. So you're going to see two birds, and they're going to be hitting a ball back and forth. Recognize that each bird independently had to be first trained to take food from the pan, to recognize when that food was coming, predictably, and then each bird independently was trained to hit the ping pong ball across the surface in order to get a food reward, a reinforcement. And then you add two birds who both know how to do this, and they're going to hit the ball back and forth.
The two pigeons are at either end of a small ping pong table. One pigeon pecks the ball as it comes toward him and knocks it toward the other pigeon. The other pigeon pecks the ball back across the table. If it goes past one pigeon, the other pigeon can eat, and if it goes the other way, the other pigeon eats. So there is it's a real game. The pigeon is reinforced for a cross-court shot if that is what gets the ball past his opponent.
Now, as I mentioned before, Skinner was fond of doing these kinds of demonstrations. What you're not getting in this video is all of that pre-training, that operant training to get the bird to first know that food is coming and when food is coming. Mostly in this case, the antecedent is sound. Sorry for that pause. I clicked when I shouldn't have clicked. Anyway, what I was saying was that for Skinner, he likes these demos, but what you're missing is some of the pre-training that has to be done in advance of a complex task. The other thing that he's trying to show is that, in fact, you can train animals very carefully to do something complicated that looks like a very organized game. But really what you have is a very carefully constructed set of learning tasks so that the organisms know how to predict when their reinforcer is coming and when it's not. He doesn't believe that these dogs or these birds, however, know that they're competing or that they have some drive to win. All they know is what kind of behaviors do I need to exhibit to get my reinforcer. And they don't even think about that too hard, right? So he's showing that is you can teach an animal, a fairly simple animal, to play a game in a very human-like way through very strict use of operant conditioning. So in this section in your chapter talking about the power of operant conditioning, Skinner really believes that this is a powerful pattern of training that can be used to explain virtually, and he would probably argue, actually everything that we do, everything that we say. in our everyday lives, we have been trained to exhibit them, even if we don't know that that training has occurred. So he argues that operant conditioning can and will take place even when people are unaware that it has happened. So what we see really depends on what has happened in the past in terms of our conditioning. We may have been partially conditioned or accidentally conditioned to respond in a certain way to a certain set of antecedents or predictors or cues. It's also, Skinner argued, possible for conditioning to persist even if we become aware that we have been conditioned. And that's true of classical conditioning as well. But if you've been systematically reinforced for, say, avoidance behavior, let's say you're anxious about something, you're fearful of it, and you systematically avoid it, you're reinforcing yourself for avoiding that behavior. Even if you know that you're being reinforced for avoiding something that makes you anxious, and you wish you could do otherwise, the conditioning is maintained, right? So it's possible for us to know we've been operantly conditioned, but still be unable to resist it, and continue to respond to our contingencies, the training contingencies that brought us there, despite that awareness. He does argue, he does admit that if you come into a situation and you know someone is going to attempt to train you, they're going to attempt to condition you using operant techniques with reinforcers or maybe punishers, the conditioning will likely still occur, but it will be slower and less effective if you have an uncooperative participant. Now, if you think of animal training, some animals are highly trainable. They're very comfortable with training. Others are not. You may be tempted to say this is an animal that just doesn't want to be trained. Skinner would argue that that is a useless inference. These subtle differences in temperament exist, but they are useless for us. We simply need to continue with our training and continue asking, using the same kinds of antecedents. We may need to up our game and get a more motivating reinforcer, one that is more within the desires of the organism. So for instance, if I have a training resistant dog, it may be that I have to get a more high value treat or a type of reinforcement that really motivates the dog. For example, in training police or military dogs, they are more often not reinforced with food reinforcers. You know, imagine you're a cop out in the field. You can't just have a bag of treats in your pocket. You know, and many of these dogs are really high drive dogs with lots of energy and a real attraction to hard work. They are often rewarded with play. So they're rewarded with a favorite tug toy or a ball that they really desire to play with. So he argues that even with humans, if they're aware that someone's trying to condition them, that they're trying to be trained with reinforcers, that it may make them more resistant, it may make them less cooperative, but and it may make the conditioning less sticky, meaning it may be less stable. So fully cooperative training with the organism is better. Another example, so my current foster dog is very, very fearful of people. If I tried too aggressively to operantly condition her to do anything while she's in this persistent fear state, it's kind of analogous to having an uncooperative human who knows what you're trying to do but doesn't want to cooperate. She doesn't know what I would be trying to do, but she would be similarly uncooperative because of the amount of anxiety that she's experiencing. Now, given that I've given you that example, I will point out Skinner would disagree with my use of the words anxiety. he would argue that, thinking about those words is not very useful. You have to look at where the organism right now is, what behaviors are they capable of right now, systematically reinforce successive approximations of what you want going forward. And that's the successful approach. Explaining it backward and talking about their fears and anxieties isn't particularly useful from Skinner's point of view. Now, we do need to remind ourselves, and I mentioned this before, what is the difference between reinforcers and punishers, because students often really struggle, especially when we bring in words like negative reinforcement or negative punishment or even positive punishment. Reinforcers are any kind of stimulus that comes after a response that makes that behavior more likely. So if I'm training a dog to sit, every time that dog sits or approximates sitting, I will reinforce with a treat or praise, probably both. So giving the treat or the praise increases the likelihood of future sitting behavior. Positive reinforcement strengthens that behavior. So if I'm giving treats or praise, that's positive reinforcement, and it strengthens the behavior that leads to that consequence. Negative reinforcement strengthens behaviors that turn it off. So if I'm nagging, that would strengthen the behavior that I'm trying to get my kids to exhibit. Think of how little kids, even though they may not know they're doing it, that whine, they're actually, in a very crafty way, through whining, strengthening, giving in behavior on the part of their parents. Or think about kids in the grocery store who pitch a royal fit in the middle of the store, right about that time when, grocery stores, being evil entities that they are, they put a whole pack of toys right in the middle of the cereal aisle. The cereal aisle is usually about 2/3 of the way through the store when kids are getting cranky and tired anyway, and voila, toys happen. So they pitch a royal fit when mom and dad are already tired or irritable. And in order to get the royal fit to stop, the parents give the kids a toy, right? So nagging or whining or throwing a fit in the grocery store strengthens the behavior that turns those annoying things off, right? Punishment is any consequence that weakens the behavior it follows. So the critical difference between reinforcers of any kind and punishers. Punishers weaken behaviors, typically only in the circumstances that directly surround and predict the punishment's occurrence. For example, if you want to decrease the likelihood of a rat occupying, say, the left-hand side of its cage, you may electrify that half of the cage. And when a warning light is on, the cage is going to shock their tiny little rat feet. That's a punishment. So what you're weakening is gravitating toward the left-hand side of the cage. Now, that's also kind of escape training. If you pair it with the light, if the rat light is off, the rat learns that it's safe to be on that side of the cage. When the light is on, they know it's not safe, so they leave. And if they're given a few seconds of escape time, they will learn very rapidly to escape, because not escaping is going to get them punished. So, tricky thing there, you have a combination in escape training of both punishment and reinforcement. The punishment, if the rat lingers on the left-hand side of the page, it gets punished. If, however, it escapes, it gets the negative reinforcer kind of kicked in of reducing the likelihood of being shocked. Another distinction that's important to make is the difference between primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers, and if you're finding you're enjoying some of this stuff, really consider taking some of Dr. Muller's classes on learning and conditioning and animal cognition. You'll find them interesting. primary reinforcers are stimuli or situations where they are innately reinforcing. So, like if I'm training an animal and I want to use food reinforcers, I use foods that the animal likes. Training treats, for example. These are primary reinforcers are things that we don't have to learn about. We respond to them like food, air, water. Those sorts of things are innately reinforcing. Now, secondary reinforcers, though, are things that you train the organism to respond to because they lead to primary reinforcers. So, for example, you can encourage, let's say, you can encourage a behavior by pairing a secondary reinforcer with a primary reinforcer. So if I want a dog to learn that praise is a good thing, because it's not innate for a dog to like being told you're a good boy or whatever, you would pair the praise words that you use with the presentation of a food reward. Eventually, the secondary reinforcer, and notice what we're doing there, secondary reinforcers are classically conditioned to work with primary reinforcers. Over time, though, they become independent. So for an example you're given in your textbook is money. We work for money. Money allows us to get things that we like, including food, and the housing that we live in, and all kinds of fun toys that we find reinforcing, and so on. So the secondary reinforcers, we learn to love them through classical conditioning, primarily because they allow us to purchase or get access to primary reinforcers, or they've simply been conditioned to be connected to those primary reinforcers. That concludes part 2 of Chapter 8, B.F. Skinner's Radical Behaviorism.